Hello, my name is Anna Buss, and for my final project, I will be talking about education and how multifaceted it is. For my project, I will be speaking about learning, assessment, teacher assessment and plans, and also differences among students. So, before we begin, let's talk about learning. When you think back into your education timeline, every single person has a favorite or specific teacher who helped inspire us and made a meaningful conversation and meaningful connections with us. These teachers oftentimes gave us hope and gave us a belief in ourselves that we didn't usually have before. And so, if it is possible, it is important for teachers to try to make those connections with students because they give them a lot to care about, and it also offers another point of buy-in in a class. For instance, if I really like a professor or a teacher, and if they seem to know who I am more likely to do well in that class because I know that they are counting on me and that they care about me and what I can do and believe in me. Also, if teachers seem to know their students, they can also put more examples that mean something to them. So, for instance, I've always been really interested in horseback riding, writing different pieces, and when a professor would actually use those information with me or kind of get to know me in that way and then use real world examples, it was very helpful and also meant a lot for me to do. It is also important that when teachers are trying to help, they can use different learning examples and different learning examples to actually explain the lesson. Learning styles, as we have learned, do not really help at all. They have no real purpose in education. But it's an important tool. But what is important is the fact that students and teachers go over the information multiple times in multiple different ways, which creates the best ideas for actual deep learning. For teachers, it is also important to know that learning is hard, and we are not designed to think. Thinking is a slow process, and to get around it, we have to create schemas of information that we've stored, and though we are naturally interested, the conditions have to be right for us to want to try, even to understand and learn concepts. We like to be challenged because we like to find the solution to a problem. The problem must be challenging, but not one we are unable to figure out. It must be the right amount of difficulty. That way we can feel good about ourselves once we complete it. Teachers also need to make sure that whatever ideas they are teaching are also appropriate for the age and ability of the student. If they are not, they will be unable to make further connections and will then feel disengaged from the material because it was too hard at one point. So later on in the classes, these children will feel uninspired and like that they are too dumb or the problem doesn't make sense and will lead to an immediate lack of wanting to learn in the future. Students are also must learn or ask questions that they have previous knowledge of. We can't expect students to have large amounts of deep thinking about a topic that they are just learning about because they don't have any background or prior knowledge to think about this while they're building their own deep knowledge. It's important to have that knowledge layered on and on and on top of each other so they can actually see the depth that is needed to understand the topic. So, with learning and to create deep knowledge beyond the surface, educators need to remember to set up classes that allow options developed for deep knowledge, which could be focusing on a few ideas that are very, very important instead of focusing on a larger idea, or just depth instead of quality. The next topic we'll be discussing is assessment. It has been shown that multiple types of assessment are the most successful for all children and students. Different students have different strengths, and multiple types of assessment allows for the ability for everyone to have an equal chance. Different methods of assessment that are common are tests, papers, presentations, and group collaboration as different assessments throughout the semester. The reason why is some people are better at taking exams, some people are better with their writing, some people are better in oral presentations, and it's important to give everyone a shot. I, for instance, have always been better with presentations and sometimes papers also, and oftentimes when it's something that I'm not familiar with or not comfortable with, it's harder for myself to do well on. The way assessment occurred changed drastically with the No Child Left Behind Act that occurred in the early 2000s. Schools and teachers were told that they had to change the way they taught and what they taught, or else they would lose money and also potentially their jobs. This is because before this time there was no national standard of education. For instance, what California was teaching was very different from what Texas was teaching by the book. Those levels and the quality of education were not the same, nor was the depth. In some ways, this was a great act because it wanted to create equality among every single state, so if someone was to move to a different place, it would still be the same type of teaching. But for some states, they actually had to lessen their standards of education, and also to try to nationalize it, a lot of standardized testing was put into schools because there's no other way to really measure if teachers and parents were actually doing the right thing or or that it was actually implemented. So with this testing, that was also not really trained, but we'll get into that later. It became very much more popular for teaching for the test instead of teaching more in depth, which is very problematic because teachers would just glide by issues and were not able to actually create the amount of depth they needed because they don't have enough time to actually layer. And so, if they wanted to keep their job or their school funding, it was important for them to make sure they covered everything in the book as little as possible to get all of those issues, which became problematic. But we'll also talk about the rest of this in teacher assessment. For teacher assessment, there's currently no ways of standardized assessments throughout all teachers. Oftentimes, it depends on the school district, the principal at the school, and other aspects along those lines. These decisions are made without proper consideration of what actually good teachers look like and how assessment should actually work. The assessment plan of teachers that seemed the most holistic in the approach that I have heard was the plan created by Michelle Rhee. While highly controversial, it appears to have different forms of assessment built into the program with experts in the field and with the grade coming in with no bias for a few classes to understand the teacher and if they are being accurate or successful in furthering learning. Having individuals not associated with the school provides no bias into the rating of the teacher's performance, like if it was a fellow principal or colleague that someone may have a disagreement with or someone may be best friends with. Michelle's plan was focusing on the growth of a student and not necessarily preset standards. I believe the impact is more substantial if you can see clearly where a child has been and where they seem to be going regarding education. After No Child Left Behind, many teachers who had a long background in education seemed to leave schools. This is because teachers were not given proper training before implementing No Child Left Behind. It was a quick process, and so educators who had a long career in the field didn't really feel welcome anymore. So teachers were forced to teach standardized material without the proper ways and training. For many, the transition was difficult without having proper grasp, and they felt unable to continue their role as an educator. Teachers are also sometimes well known for not being well paid, and so for this really difficult career where you help students all day and try to make an impact, not being very well paid is also another disadvantage, especially with the current education system and the current beliefs with that. Because of this, there's not that many great forms of assessment for teachers because we also don't want to lose them either. The next item I will be talking about is differences among students and tracking. Tracking is a practice that normally sets children up for career goals. This could be trade or tech school, mathematics, sciences, English, literature, etc. Tracking normally tries to take their own strengths and use them to figure out what would be best for them in their long run and in high school. Tracking as a practice in schools often takes the ability to move from phases, can take away the guidance opportunities of teachers and critical thinking in lower tracks, and takes away the future potential for movement and growth. Oftentimes, children are put in these tracks early on, and they start learning things at different paces or slower paces than what other tracks do. So to even be considered to move to a different track, a student might have to undergo months of different material. Tracking also takes away the opportunity for growth in their models depending on the tracks that they're in. Putting children at a young age into a specific track does not allow them to properly go through the stages on their own time period, especially in the lower tracks. Once a student is placed in the lower tracks, it is incredibly difficult to get out because they are learning the information at a much slower pace and are not taught at the same level of others, which allows them less opportunity to go through the stages of the different tracks. With tracking regularly, the not as experienced teacher teaches the lower tracks, which do those students a greater service. The teacher, in some cases, do not give the proper guidance or instill the motivation needed for those students. The students know what track they are in, and being in a lower track can make students feel dumb and does not allow motivation to occur because they don't believe they should try. And not having a great teacher to instill confidence and motivate them, the students can end up not caring as much and being very dissociated with school. Those in the lower tracks are often not as challenged or work in critical thinking problems like those in higher tracks. Often the material is taught to them with no higher levels of thinking due to the believed level of the students, the experience of the teacher, or just the way the class is set up with a focus on drills and not critical thinking. Another aspects of differences among students are neighborhood public schools. All public schools are not funded the same. I think that is a given. People are allowed to move into different neighborhoods with better school systems, and better schools often are not equal to lower schools. If education is really supposed to be about equality and everyone having a chance, is that really fair? The difficult issue is that if we do want children to all have the same level of school, we need to bring up the schools that don't perform as well. How do we do that? And is it fair to make students in schools and districts that are normally seen as good move and travel to those schools? Is it fair to have lower income children also travel to those schools? Is it fair to add 2-hour commutes to both of them? It's a difficult question to ask because both sides have very good arguments against the reasons of why. These school districts oftentimes end up not being really diverse or racially inclusive because it's self-selective discrimination in some sorts, because oftentimes white families will move into like white neighborhoods, or African Americans will move into like the same neighborhoods and communities that they've grown up in different aspects along those lines. And those children who end up not going end up not really having a diverse group of people to actually be educated by and with. Also, some public schools are able to find funding from other places, like through parents' donations and other fundraisers. But this can only happen if they normally come from a wealthier neighborhood or have that actual option. A lot of times, school districts that do not seem to do as great or well don't really have any extra money lying around. And is it fair to give the schools the same amount of funding, even though the better schools or the better districts seem to be able to fundraise and create money on their own? Is that fair or is that equal? Education is a multifaceted issue that still needs a lot of work. There's a lot of work we need to do as teachers, as educators, as students to make sure that everyone is getting as good of an education as possible. It's important that we take into account the different aspects that affect education, like the ones spoken about with assessment, teacher assessment, learning, and also the differences between groups. It's important to have those considerations when trying to figure out what is the best next step for education. Thank you so much for listening.